evening, Brian. How's it going today?
Good, good. Are we live?
We are live. I like to just jump right on in there.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine with me. I'm good. How are you doing, Candace?
I'm doing really well. It's been a lot of fun with these podcasts, getting everything organized and producing them so everyone gets to see everything we're up to.
Good. Yeah, you're doing a great job with it. I've seen some of them, and the response to these podcasts have been outstanding.
That's awesome. Well, Brian, I hear more and more about the importance of acquiring industry recognized certifications. Can you provide more perspective on this?
Sure. So, well, let's just start back with the difference in the perception of what it is a certification and what isn't a certification. So, in the industry today, there are a lot of purportedly certifications. I think when people talk about getting certified, they always assume that they're getting certified under a quote certification. And that's just not the case. So let's start by talking about the difference between a certificate of training or just a certificate and a certification. A certificate is simply an indication that an individual has gone through some prescribed training of some sort. It could be, honestly, it could be anything. It could be you, for instance, teaching somebody the ins and outs of podcasting, and they complete the training regimen that you've laid out, and you then say you are certified or you have a certificate. But nobody ever says you have a certificate. They always use the term certification, which is the root cause of really the problem. A certification is something very different. A certification is something that is third party accredited. In other words, a third party has looked at what you've done and they've accredited that as being or having followed a prescribed process of development. Certifications are much longer to develop. They require the input of industry experts across the board. So it can't be a Candace Haynes saying, these are the things that somebody needs to know to do podcasting.
For sure.
Right. If you were to do a certification for podcasting, what you would have to do is engage, first of all, subject matter experts in podcasting, which are representative of all the industry players or all the industry leaders in podcasting. You'd have to then create a chart of skills and duties that somebody would have to perform to be able to be an effective podcaster. And then you'd have to take that body of knowledge and, at a minimum, take that body of knowledge and send it out to the entire industry to get thousands of respondents and feedback about what you did right, about what you did wrong, about what needs to change. And that's just the first step. I won't belabor the point with all the subsequent steps required to develop a certification. But suffice it to say, it's significant enough for ISO, the International Organization of Standards, to have a complete standard, which is called 17024, which directs the guidelines or lays out the guidelines for developing a true certification. And so it's unfortunate that in the field, it's so difficult for people who are trying to come up in the professional ranks to sort out what certificates are really, the term is certifications, they use loosely, what certifications they need that have value really for any industry, and which are the ones that are strictly a proprietary definition of skill sets, which are, as we said, certificates, not certifications. And I'll just stop there to see if you have any more questions, because it is a common misunderstanding, both in our automation industry and across the board in any technical field.
No, I think you explained that wonderfully, because if, that was a great example about the podcast. So referring back to the building automation industry, if I'm looking to increase and enhance my skills and I'm not aware of the difference that you just made, that I am actually sitting for a certificate and not a certification. That's so important to know that difference, because as you mentioned, the certification, the key point that I've gathered is that that's third party accredited, and you have these professionals that are reviewing the content that goes into that test, whereas the certificate could be, like you said, I could write up a certificate and I could have a couple people underneath me saying that they have um, their skill set or their certificate came from Candace Haynes, and that's not going to be uh, the industry. The podcast industry isn't going to recognize that. So I do understand. I see the difference. There's such a clear difference, but the words are so similar. It seems
Mhm.
so easy to get that
Yeah.
confused.
And to continue on that thread for a moment, in our industry, there are the latter, I guess, as you describe it, the former is the Candace Haynes definition of podcasting. So
Hmm.
let's pull on that thread for a minute.
Hmm.
So in every industry, there's a company who sets out particular guidelines for training that are related to their equipment. And if their equipment is such that it's pervasive in the industry, let's use the example of Cisco certifications, which they call certifications. Cisco certifications are not certifications. They
Interesting.
probably sue me if they watch this podcast. So,
Probably.
but
But
actually,
it's
I've said this to Cisco and others, and I'll use another example. And their eyes widened, but when I explained it, they got what I was saying.
hmm
It's a high value certificate. Cisco in the IT world is a very high value certificate, which everyone in the IT world should aspire to. But make no mistake, it is proprietary to Cisco. So not every certificate is going to have value like that, right? There are a whole slew of certificates in the IT industry which don't have really value as the Cisco certificate does. In our industry, for instance, I'm Niagara AX certified, which means that I went to training to become Niagara certified on tritium equipment, which is pervasive in our industry. That is, while it's called a certification, it is a certificate of training because it's defined by one organization and has not been, it has not followed that certification process. However, in our industry, if you're going to be an integrator, you should really have, I wouldn't say have to have, you should have that certificate of training, which requires a week of sitting in a classroom and then taking a test. It's all proprietary in nature, but there's value to that, right? What we're doing at ACP is establishing the industry's first non-proprietary ISO aligned certification, which has been a multi-year, very expensive effort to achieve because of the reasons I mentioned previously.
So I'm already understanding some of those differences, as you mentioned, between the certificate and the certification. For individuals who are inquiring about this ACP certification or others like it, what questions can they ask to determine what they're investigating? Is it a certificate or a certification?
Yeah, that's very good. So there is, as we've mentioned, so much confusion about what's a certification. Everybody says they're certifications.
Hmm.
There are very, very, very few certifications, right? For somebody to understand what is a certification, what's a certificate, a couple very quick questions they can ask. Number one, first and foremost, did it follow a process? Did it follow an ISO, the International Organization of Standards process? Is it accredited by ANSI, for instance, American National Standards Institute, or is it not? Right. That's probably the most pertinent question. Has a third party, which is a non-biased third party, by the way,
Hmm.
because there can be biased third parties that can just look at it and say, hey, it's fine. But does it have that ANSI ISO alignment or not? That will not tell you for sure that it's not a certification, but it will give you a very clear indication. Number two, is it representative of an entire industry, or is it proprietary in nature? And what I mean by that is it delivered by, was it created by, and is it delivered by one organization which has proprietary interests or commercial interests? Nothing wrong with that. But if you're looking for a high value certification, it's not going to be delivered in that format. It's going to, a certifying body is going to be either a nonprofit, which has a particular focus, such as ACP, or some other governmental organization which carries the burden of maintaining that the question banks and the integrity of the question banks and the ongoing metrics you have to apply to the questions, if they're good questions or not. So an individual could also look at the organization who's offering that certificate or certification and see if it has proprietary interests or if it's representing a broader set of interests. And then finally, it's kind of related to that last point. How many organizations were involved? How many people have had eyes on this certificate, or who was involved in developing it? You know, with a certification, you can track the lineage once a certification is out about the individuals. Who exactly was involved? How many subject matter experts were engaged? Were they representative of the entire industry? Were they geographically represented? Or did they all come from one city? You know, with a certification, the answers to those questions are going to be very clear because they're dictated by the ISO guidelines that you have to have representation of large companies, small companies, industry sectors, geography, all across the board. That's why certifications are such high value and so expensive to pursue. But that is what ACP has done.
And Brian, those are some really good questions. You know, I think you made a good point. I think we stop sometimes when we're looking into things, we stop and look at the well-known company, their name, their presence in particular industries that we're looking at certifications, and we don't do our due diligence. Well, you don't know what you don't know. And so now we know, that it's important to look past the name of the organization, look past just that one that might be producing it or promoting it, to look and see deeper who else may be having who may be a part of that particular certification or certificate, and then
That's right.
understand the difference between the two. So thank you for that. I think that is going to help a lot of people.
I'd like to add one more point to that.
Oh, yes.
I don't want to give the impression that there aren't high value certificates out there. There definitely are. I have a number of certificates in the industry, and as an educator and as an industry professional, I have a number of so-called certifications, which are mostly certificates, but they're high value and they're worthwhile. But if somebody really wants to get an understanding of maybe one that they're looking at that does not have that industry recognition, or it's not being asked at the interview table,
Yes.
you definitely want to understand the difference between a certification and a certificate.
I'm glad you said that too, because I was just thinking that it depends on the person's career path. It depends on where they are and their need. And so I'm glad you made that point that, all of the certificates and the certifications that are of high value, I think, to your point, they, depending on your particular circumstances, they could all be beneficial. Just what you're wanting to communicate to listeners is that it's important to understand before you go ahead and move forward with it. So that's
be informed. Yep.
Be informed. If I were a student or industry professional considering pursuing a certification, would you describe what are the benefits of pursuing a certification?
So if we're talking a true certification now, we're talking about something that's been vetted by an entire industry or a large sample size of an entire industry. So you likely have a result which is inherently high value because it's an industry speaking instead of one organization. But to me, the real value proposition is it clearly outlines the areas of competency that an individual has to demonstrate and show to become certified, to gain that certification. But so it has value in defining an individual's skill sets, not just to the individual about what they have to gain, but more importantly, or just as importantly, to an employer to understand what's the benchmark of training, what's the benchmark of skills, abilities, knowledge that this individual has. So if I'm an employer, which I have been in the automation industry for a long time, off and on, I would want to know more than just what's on somebody's resume, what they say they can do. I would really be interested in knowing what they've demonstrated they can do on a certification. And another important point of that for the value proposition for somebody who's pursuing a certification. Certifications also go beyond just the demonstration of skills on paper. There's something called a scheme for every certification. And a scheme is not something, it sounds nefarious or whatever. It's not anything nefarious.
Mm-hmm.
It is a full set of requirements of the individual which they must meet to be able to sit for the certification. So even prior to sitting for a certification, an individual must demonstrate that they've had the proper training either in the classroom or in the industry or a combination of both to be able to sit for the certification. And beyond that, it goes further into looking at their backgrounds. Every certification is going to have some benchmark of background. For instance, let's just talk about a criminal background. Some certifications will require that individuals not have a felony, or that they only have a certain class of felony, or that they only have a misdemeanor on their record to be able to sit. Or some may require that they don't have anything on their record. It depends on the scheme. The scheme also defines the reasons why an individual would be stripped of their certification. Maybe they've done something unethical or whatever. So my point here is that it gives an indication and a value, not just of the skills themselves, which are primary and front and center in nature, but it also gives a picture to the employer of the entire individual, because that individual has had to take the time and open up their background to a sufficient level to be able to qualify to sit for that certification. That scheme is also developed and refined over time by a group of subject matter experts. So every stage of a certification is being checked, balanced, reviewed, vetted. It's an ongoing process that never ends, which is what lends the value proposition to an individual for gaining a certification.
Going back to the scheme, that's interesting because I'm wondering, is there a way that before you want to sit for this test, what are things that you can do in order to make sure you demonstrate these schemes, and how do they check them off before the certification? Like, how do you present? I'm not sure what you would present before the certification. Like, what would that process be? I guess it's like a application you have to fill out.
Yeah, it's a complete package that you have to fill out and has to be reviewed and assessed, and then compared with the scheme document itself. So a
Oh,
scheme
okay,
is,
I see.
yeah, the scheme is a set of prescribed and codified rules and regulations for the certification. And it is developed by, as I said, a panel of industry experts, and who determine the background, the skills, the abilities, and all the things, the education, the number of years of education, et cetera, somebody has to demonstrate. So a scheme really is a set of rules. And if somebody were to apply, let's say, to become certified through ACP, they would have to present their educational background. They'd have to present
Okay.
their professional background. They'd have to provide a letter of reference. They'd have to open up themselves to a criminal background check. Some of those things they'd have to do. And to maintain the certification, there's a requirement for ongoing, as with most certifications, some ongoing continuing education. So if somebody were to prepare or a packet to sit for certification, they'd have to just check off all those items to meet the scheme requirements of ACP's certification, for instance. But every certification is going to have its own particular scheme, a set of rules and regulations which govern the certification, and which eliminate the subjectivity of any one individual saying, "Oh, well, we don't like this person for whatever reason.
Yes.
They can't sit for the certification." There can be none of that in a
Right. It's
certification.
merit based. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And I'm wondering, is that same process, selection process, if you will, is that the same for if you're just getting a certificate versus the certification?
Oh, well, I'll give you some examples of certificates that I've had in the past. I've had one I remember when I was young. I pursued a refrigerant handling so-called certification. It's really a certificate
No.
by the EPA. This one happens to be by the Environmental Protection Agency. It's called 608 certification. And anybody who handles refrigerants, because they have an impact, or you more so used to have an impact on the ozone layer of the earth, would have to get this certificate, or this what they call certification. In that case, you could just walk into any training location that was offering training, and they would teach you almost exactly what was going to be on that test. I'm not trying to besmirch the quality or the value of it, but there was no demonstration of prior knowledge or training or industry exposure, none of that. You could just simply sit for the exam and take some training, sit for the exam. And so it's all over the place. I use that as just one example. It's all over the place with certificates because they don't follow those guidelines, right? So
Yes.
you could have some which are high value. The 608 is of high value. If you're going to work in the industry, you have to have it. Is it, it's defined by the EPA. So, I mean, there's no question that it's high value. You just have to have it. And there are certificates like that, but there are others out there that, I mean, you would have to question the value there, and the requirements to sit for and take those certificates they're just not governed by any third party. So they can be all over the map.
That's good to know. That's another big difference between the certificate and the certification process. Now, once we get this certification, what does it take to keep it?
That can also be all over the place, but in the certification world, again, there's typically going to be a requirement for ongoing education. And there are specific requirements for ACP for its technician certification, building automation systems technician certification. Those have not been shared yet. It's defined by the scheme committee in our announcement, which unfortunately has been impacted by the COVID crisis, which we're all experiencing. There will be guidelines that dictate the exact number of continuing education hours that you need to maintain your building automation technician certification, as guided by our scheme committee and scheme documents.
Thank you, Brian. I think I got a great overview of the advantages and the differences between a certificate and a certification, the advantages of taking a high value certification. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back.